The story of the 106th Coastal Artillery Battalion begins in the mountains and lowlands of Kentucky and stretches back to irregular units first formed during the American Civil War. Over the years and various iterations, a National Guard unit was established. Given the geography of Kentucky and the prominence of farming as a profession, it seemed only logical for the men to constitute a mounted unit, and they became the 123rd Cavalry. As war broke out in Europe in 1939, the U.S. Army began evaluating its own preparedness and the type of units necessary in modern warfare. It was determined that mounted soldiers were largely obsolete in a mechanized type of war, and cavalry elements were largely reassigned. In 1940, the 123rd was redesignated the 106th Coastal Artillery Battalion. Coastal artillery was designed to protect harbors and coastlines. Large caliber forms of artillery, installed at designated points, were tasked with defending against ships moving at a distance. This might seem like a strange vocation for men from the landlocked state of Kentucky, many of whom had probably never even seen an ocean. However, the Army had decided that coastal artillery were the most natural units in which to integrate anti aircraft weapons, given the similarity in task, aiming and firing a stationary artillery weapon at a moving target from a considerable distance. The 106th would be an anti aircraft unit. Sensing that America would eventually be dragged into the war, many National Guard units were federalized, and the call came for the 106th on January 6, 1941. A week later, still wearing their cavalry uniforms and trooper hats, the men boarded a train in Springfield, Kentucky, and departed for their training location, Camp Hewlin, Texas, to learn their new role in anti aircraft operations. Several forms of anti aircraft weapons were available, including spotlights, barrage balloons, and large caliber guns designed to shoot down high level bombers. The 106th, however, was designated an automatic weapons battalion and assigned the 40mm Bofors gun, a Swedish made weapon designed to protect primarily against dive bombers and low flying aircraft. Although reliable and widely used by the militaries of the world, the Bofors gun required a relatively large crew of at least 10 men to operate, which mandated intensive training and skilled teamwork. At Camp Hewlin, the men learned how to transport, load, aim, and fire the Bofors gun and become soldiers in a modern army. The 106th Coastal Artillery Battalion was organized into 5 batteries, 4 tasked with operating the weapons and identified as batteries A, B, C, and D, and the 5th being the headquarters of the battalion. Each of the firing batteries operated 8 Bofors guns and included approximately 160 enlisted men. Including the officers and men assigned to the headquarters battery, the size of the 106th would average around 800 to 850 soldiers throughout the war. On December 7, 1941, the United States found itself suddenly engaged in World War II. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor resulted in a torrent of men signing up to fight while the draft filled out the ranks. On January 11, 1942, the Selective Service Board drew the number of Hayden Allen, a small farmer from Hanshu, Kentucky, a rural community in the hollers of Appalachia. Allen made the 175-mile trek to Fort Thomas and his induction into the U.S. Army. He was assigned to his local unit, the 106th, and boarded a train bound for Camp Hewlin. Once arriving in Texas, he was integrated into Battery C and went to work alongside his fellow soldiers. But he would not remain in Texas for long. Orders were received in March, and the 106th were on their way to Europe. Allen had just barely completed his 12 weeks of basic and unit training before boarding a train bound for New York City. On April 30th, 1942, the 106th boarded the RMS Aquitania and sailed out of New York Harbor as part of a larger convoy headed for Britain. The convoy of 19 ships, carrying over 34,000 soldiers, made the journey during the peak of the Battle of the Atlantic, with German U-boat wolf packs lurking below the waves on a mission to sink Allied shipping. Several times during the 106th crossing, submarine alarms sounded and escort destroyers went into standard maneuvers, tossing depth charges into the ocean. However, it is unclear if any U-boats were ever in the vicinity, as none of the ships were directly attacked, and no signs of debris or oil ever followed the detonation of the explosives. On May 11th, the convoy safely reached the River Clyde, and the 106th disembarked in Gowrick, Scotland. A few days later, the unit was transferred by ferry across the North Channel to their training base in Ballykinler, Northern Ireland. At the same time the 106th crossed the Atlantic, President Roosevelt and his generals were busy planning the first American land operations of the war. Roosevelt was eager to get American soldiers into the fight, and with operations in the Pacific largely focused on naval combat, the Army headed to the European theater. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill suggested a Mediterranean strategy focused on North Africa and Italy, but American military commanders preferred a direct landing on mainland Europe and a drive toward Berlin. Roosevelt sided with Churchill, and the generals went to work on planning an amphibious invasion of North Africa, codenamed Operation Torch. During the summer of 1942, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and his Africa Corps sprinted across Libya and Egypt with the goal of taking the Suez Canal, which would effectively cut off British oil supplies. Operation Torch was meant to relieve pressure on Egypt by forcing the Germans and their Italian allies to confront a force landing in their rear and threatening their own supply lines from mainland Italy and Sicily. The 106th transferred to England in preparation for the offensive. They were to be a part of the largest amphibious force in history to that point, with 850 warships converging in the Atlantic Ocean and carrying over 100,000 men. The 106th sailed away from the British Isles on October 19, 1942, with their war about to begin. Allied soldiers hit the beaches on November 8th, landing in a three-pronged attack. One force, sailing directly from Hampton Roads, Virginia, came ashore in Morocco with the goal of taking Casablanca, while the larger force from England hit Algiers and Oran in Algeria. As a separate battalion, the 106th was not formally attached to any specific division, but could be shuffled between larger units depending on their need for anti-aircraft support. For the invasion of North Africa, the 106th was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division, more popularly known as the Big Red One, and landed at Arzew, just east of Oran. The 106th quickly set up their Bofors guns on the beaches and looked to the skies, but encountered relatively light Luftwaffe activity. Hayden Allen's Battery C redeployed to the Tafroy airfield south of Oran the next day, while the rest of the 106th remained on the beaches to provide support to the landing zones. A few days later, the remainder of the unit redeployed to the Tafroy and La Sena airfields. For all intents and purposes, the Axis forces were surprised by the Allied invasion. 3 days after the landings in Morocco and Algeria, Rommel and his forces began a hurried retreat from Egypt, having finally been checked by British General Bernard Montgomery and his men at El Alamein. Rommel's Africa Corps was now trapped in an Allied pincer, and he frantically raced toward Tunisia to shorten his lines of supply with mainland Italy and Sicily, and to regroup for a defense of what remained of Axis-held North Africa. The American soldiers and their British allies in Algeria and Morocco quickly secured their gains and pushed to the east. On November 14th, less than a week after landing, the 106th was on the move, headed toward Algiers. This was the beginning of 7 straight days of convoying that took them over the Atlas Mountains and into Tunisia. Most of the 106th set up positions on November 20th at Souk El Arba on the road to Tunis, while Hayden Allen's Battery C was detached from the main group and sent to guard an airfield further south at Tebessa. For the first time in the war, the 106th saw sustained combat. The Allied advance placed them within range of German fighters and bombers stationed in Sicily, significantly multiplying Axis air cover. At the same time, the Allies had relatively few aircraft in forward areas, which left the anti-aircraft units as the only protection for ground troops from dive bombers and strafing fighter planes. Air raids became a constant way of life for Allied troops, and the 106th was in the thick of the fight on a daily basis. So intense was the aerial assault that Allied troops nicknamed the region Stuka Valley, after the feared German dive bomber that relentlessly attacked American and British forces. December 1942 would see the most popularized events of the entire war for the 106th, particularly the exploits of Private Sammy Burns of Battery C. One afternoon, without warning, 7 German Junker Ju-88 bombers appeared in the skies over the position of several trucks belonging to the battery. The only defense available was a 50 caliber machine gun mounted to the top of one of the trucks. Private Burns and another unknown soldier leapt into action. They quickly loaded the gun and began firing at the approaching aircraft. After the planes attacked, they circled around for another pass. Given that the 50 caliber gun only rotated 180 degrees, Burns jumped into the cab of the truck, turned it around, and then climbed back up to begin firing the gun again just as the planes approached. This sequence repeated several times until the 50 caliber gun overheated. By the end of the attack, 2 German planes were shot down, and a third flew away with smoke billowing out. An officer approached Burns afterwards and asked where he was from. Burns calmly replied, "Kentucky, sir." The officer shook his head and said, "I might have known it." For his courage under fire, Burns received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest honor for valor, and the most prestigious decoration received by any member of the 106th during the war. By the beginning of 1943, the top American commander in the field, Major General Lloyd Friedendahl, had devised a plan for his Second Corps to attack into southern Tunisia. Hayden Allen's Battery C was again detached from the battalion and assigned to an armored unit moving with the advance. The offensive quickly stalled, and by February, the front had settled into a stalemate. The Americans had taken up forward positions near Sidi Bouzid, and the 106 batteries were dispersed. Batteries A and B set up positions at Spatla, Battery D protected Friedendahl's headquarters at Tebessa in Algeria, and Hayden Allen's Battery C remained with the armored unit, guarding the right flank of the Allied line at Gafsa. In a move later widely criticized, Friedendahl chose not to construct forward defensive positions, or to concentrate his forces, instead opting to reinforce his command and supply centers in the rear and split up different elements within his divisions that effectively prevented coordinated combat actions. Some weeks before, Rommel and his Africa Corps reached Tunisia, where they refitted, were reinforced, and joined with the forces of General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. Short on supplies, and sensing weak and uncoordinated American lines, on February 14, 1943, the German forces unleashed a blistering assault that caught the Americans by surprise. They quickly routed the American defenders at Sidi Bouzid, and within 3 days had taken Spatla. German forces also struck farther south at Gafsa. It was a brilliant and coordinated move that quickly overwhelmed the Americans, and with the potential of soon being surrounded, a hasty evacuation was ordered. In the coming days, the American forces and the forward batteries of the 106th retreated in the face of battle-hardened German soldiers with superior equipment. The combined German forces pressed on through Kasserine Pass, brushing aside American and French soldiers with poorly constructed defensive works. The road to Tebessa was open. But then events turned. Rommel, in an uncharacteristic moment, hesitated. He was under orders to move north in the hopes of trapping British forces, but his Africa Corps was only 25 miles from the supplies at Tebessa. He decided to split his forces, and as a result, granted the American defenders and their French allies a reprieve. The American line stiffened, reinforcements arrived, and the Germans lost the initiative. Within days, Rommel's men retreated back through Kasserine Pass, and by February 25th, the lines returned to their positions of February 14th. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was the first large-scale engagement of American soldiers with the German Wehrmacht, and it was not a good showing. Although technically a victory, of the 30,000 American soldiers engaged in combat, over 6,000 became casualties and 4,000 were captured. For the Germans, the casualty estimate was roughly 1,000 men killed or wounded. The American commanding officer, General Dwight Eisenhower, quickly sacked Friedendahl, and the American army was left to assess and reorganize. Anti-aircraft units became a focus of this self-examination.
The few anti-aircraft forces positioned forward with the Second Corps fought well, but suffered from a lack of firepower, mobility, training with maneuver units, and, like the rest of the Army, combat experience.
The question of mobility became a primary focus. During the hasty withdrawals from Gafsa and Spatla in the first days of the battle, many of the 106th Bofors guns were left behind, leaving the unit to man smaller caliber machine guns for the remainder of the battle. The amount of time required to break down the Bofors guns and fix them for transport simply was not available. Similarly, the stationary nature of the Bofors guns meant they could not maneuver well in mechanized combat. Nonetheless, German air superiority at Kasserine Pass and elsewhere in Tunisia taught that more anti-aircraft weapons were needed to cover advancing units. By the end of the North Africa campaign, anti-aircraft battalions were credited with shooting down 526 enemy aircraft, but the relative lack of training and experience resulted in these units shooting down many of their own planes as well. Clearly, anti-aircraft battalions were valuable to the war effort, but changes in methods and weapons were necessary. After the fall of German forces in Tunisia in May 1943, the 106th Coastal Artillery Battalion was reunited for the first time in months and sent back to Oran to learn a new method of anti-aircraft warfare. The 106th learned quickly that their new approach to anti-aircraft operations required skilled movement capable of keeping pace with tanks and mechanized soldiers. Their trucks were replaced with half-tracks, and the Bofors guns were replaced with mounted 37mm and 50 caliber machine guns. Experiences in North Africa, including the heroics of Sammy Burns, demonstrated the effectiveness of such weapons to shoot down enemy dive bombers, and having the weapons mounted on half-tracks eliminated many of the unit's problems with mobility. Little training time was required for the use of the new weapons, which was a benefit, as the 106th was quickly pressed into service for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Churchill called Italy the soft underbelly of Europe, and Italy became the setting for a long desired second front on the continent. On July 10, 1943, the invasion began, with the 106th attached to the 3rd Infantry Division and landing at Red Beach, 2 miles west of Licata. Relatively little was expected of Italian coastal defenses, but the ease of the landings remained surprising. By the end of the first day, American and British forces had already pushed several miles inland. Nonetheless, aerial attacks were relatively heavy, and the 106th was credited with shooting down 10 enemy planes on the first day. After a week of guarding the landing area and the airport near Licata, the 106th was reassigned to the 2nd Armored Division and joined in their dash for the city of Palermo on the northwest coast. By July 22nd, American forces had entered the city, covering the island in less than 2 weeks. The 106th remained with the 2nd Armored Division at Palermo through the remainder of the fighting in Sicily, with American and British infantry units farther to the east chasing the Germans to their evacuation point at Messina. Increased Allied air cover meant the 106th was not fighting Axis planes alone, and after the first few days in Sicily, they saw limited aerial combat and primarily assisted artillery and armored units in their tasks. The 106th next mission proved significantly more difficult. Codenamed Operation Avalanche, the invasion of mainland Italy presented Allied planners with significant difficulties, not the least of which being that only 3 Allied assault divisions were available, half of the strength that came ashore in Sicily. The 106th was attached to the 45th Infantry Division. The attack began on September 9, 1943, and batteries A and B dropped anchor 10 miles south of Salerno, while Hayden Allen's Battery C arrived in the same location the following morning. However, heavy enemy air attacks stifled the landing, and none of the 106 batteries made it ashore until nearly 10 p.m. on the night of September 10th. While Allied air strength was nearly 3 times that of the Axis forces, American and British planes traveled from more distant Sicilian air bases, which meant that anti-aircraft battalions were kept busy. By September 12th, Battery C had pushed nearly 3 miles inland alongside elements of the 45th Infantry Division, while Batteries A and B provided cover for the landing zone. Battery D arrived on September 13th and set up positions to protect supply depots on the beach. Counter to Churchill's predictions, Italy was not a soft target. Although Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was deposed 6 weeks before the Allied landings at Salerno, and Italy had already capitulated, the Germans had no intention of surrendering the peninsula and poured reinforcements into the mountainous country. The Germans enjoyed excellent defensive terrain and appeared content to wage a slugging war of attrition with the Allied forces. From October 1st to 9th, not a single enemy plane was spotted by the 106th, but when the Germans did finally strike, it was intense. Between October 10th and 14th, dozens of German planes appeared each day, and the 106th went to work, shooting down several. Throughout October and into November, the 45th Infantry Division, and along with them the 106th, advanced north of Naples and settled into a winter defensive line around the city of Cassino and its neighboring mountain stronghold, Monte Cassino. The 106th primary task was defending the division's field artillery battalions, a popular target for German dive bombers. For several months, Italy was a quagmire, with both sides entrenched in mountainous terrain that favored the defender. On January 17, 1944, American troops began pushing on Monte Cassino, resulting in a tough and slow-moving 4-month-long battle, but the 106th was not there. A month earlier, given the stalemate, the American commanding officer in Italy, General Mark Clark, began contemplating a new strategy. His plan was to land forces in the German rear, near Anzio, creating a beachhead that would force the enemy to weaken their defenses at Cassino and elsewhere. On January 7, 1944, the 106th began a pullback, reassembled in Naples, and embarked for Anzio. On January 22nd, the assault began, and batteries B, C, and D, along with the headquarters battery, were attached to elements of the 3rd Infantry Division and landed on the first day near Nettuno, just east of Anzio. Although the Allies achieved complete surprise, German artillery soon battered the landing zones, and air attacks were immediate, ferocious, and sustained. On January 24th, 6 German FW-190s attacked the ships still unloading men and supplies. Batteries B and C opened up on the attacking planes, firing over 2,600 rounds within minutes. Barely 3 hours later, 13 German planes appeared over the port of Anzio. All 3 firing batteries engaged the enemy and shot nearly 14,000 rounds of ammunition. Throughout the last week of January, the 106th averaged firing 12,000 rounds of ammunition a day, as German attacks continued roughly every 3 hours.
Enemy air activity during this period has been more intense than in any period experienced by this unit since the early days of the Tunisian campaign. Air attacks in force come as frequently as 5 times a day.
On February 8th, the 106th rejoined the 45th Infantry Division, which had landed to reinforce the Allied salient around Anzio. The 106th was again assigned to the division's field artillery battalions by special request.
The battalion commanders requested that the batteries that had previously protected them be reassigned the same missions. These requests exemplify the feeling of confidence, teamwork, and cooperation which has developed between this organization and the division.
The protection of anti-aircraft batteries was much needed. The Americans and their British allies tried repeatedly to break out of the Anzio beachhead, unsuccessfully. The Germans counterattacked, forcing the Allies to take defensive positions and protect their lines around the port. The Allied contingent at Anzio was surrounded and neutralized. February was a trying month for the 106th, with the battalion's monthly report indicating that enemy air activity was as intense as any period previously experienced by the unit during the war. By March, however, the forward positions guarded by the 106th saw fewer aerial attacks, as German planes focused on the ships and harbor in the rear. Allied planes also frequently appeared in the skies above to challenge German planes. Nonetheless, German artillery fire kept up a steady stream of action and became the largest threat to the 106th. By April, the 106th noticed significant reductions in both enemy air attacks and artillery shelling, and by May, combat was infrequent. Allied troops at Monte Cassino had broken through the line on May 18th, and the Germans began to fall back. For the encircled American and British soldiers at Anzio, relief was finally at hand. The months of intense fighting took a significant human toll on the 106th, as it suffered 43 casualties, including 7 men killed in action, by far the bloodiest engagement of the entire war for the unit. In return, the 106th claimed 36 enemy planes either destroyed or probably destroyed, and 43 planes damaged. However, their effectiveness cannot be measured just in the number of aircraft struck. Reports frequently documented fighter planes pulling out of strafing runs and bombers dropping their payloads early in the face of withering fire from the 106 batteries. Total Allied casualties at Anzio are estimated at 43,000 men, but it could have been much worse.
That the cost was not greater reflected ferocious anti-aircraft defense. 1,000 guns made the beachhead among Europe's most fortified precincts.
The anti-aircraft units at Anzio did their job, and they did it well. Between the sustained pummeling at Monte Cassino and repeated efforts to eliminate the Anzio beachhead, German soldiers were exhausted and battered. The opportunity was ripe for the Allies to break out of Anzio and trap several German divisions retreating from Cassino. However, in search of glory and respect, General Clark decided instead to race up the coast toward Rome, hoping to beat the British to the capital. The Americans secured the Eternal City on June 4, 1944, with the 45th Infantry Division in the vanguard and the 106th by their side. The capture of Rome dominated the headlines in the world's newspapers, but the attention lasted only one day. On June 6th, Allied forces hit the beaches of Normandy, and the Italian theater was quickly ignored. With practically no enemy air activity, the 106th was relieved on June 17th. In July 1944, officially reorganized as the 106th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, the unit returned to Salerno and began preparing for another invasion, this time with the target being southern France. Operation Dragoon was designed to sap German strength from Normandy and other northern regions and open supply routes through the ports at Toulon and Marseille. On August 15th, the 106th made their fifth and final amphibious landing of the war, again in support of the 45th Infantry Division. They came ashore in the French Riviera near the town of Saint-Maximin, and the entire battalion was in place and ready to fight by 2 p.m., but no enemy planes appeared over the landing zone. For the next several weeks, enemy planes were a rare sight, and when they did attack, no more than 2 or 3 planes took part. The German Luftwaffe was short of pilots and aircraft, and Allied planes firmly controlled the skies. For the first time in the war, anti-aircraft units found themselves without a discernible aerial foe to fight. Within 2 weeks, the ports had fallen, and American soldiers were dashing up the River Rhone toward Lyon, with a relatively small German army group falling back in a speedy retreat. By September 14th, the Allies had seized Dijon and pushed the Germans into the rivers and mountains of eastern France, where they finally made a stand. In their rapid advance, American forces faced only sporadic air attack, leaving the anti-aircraft crews to develop a new specialty. Given the mechanized advance, half-tracks with their mounted machine guns proved highly effective at supporting infantry against ground forces. The 106th joined regiments of the 45th Infantry Division in guarding bridges and crossroads, and provided covering and harassing fire to repulse German counterattacks. This new task is best exemplified by the events of September 27, 1944, that occurred just east of Epinal. An American infantry unit came under fire from Germans entrenched in a wooded area. They called up two half-tracks of Hayden Allen's Battery C, who immediately came under mortar fire. The infantry pointed out the location of the enemy, and the anti-aircraft men opened up with their heavy weaponry. The mortar fire abruptly stopped, and Battery C provided effective cover as the infantry infiltrated the woods and flushed out the German defenders. Colonel John Hennigan best summarized the impact of this new role for anti-aircraft units.
The effect has been to bring controlled artillery support in much closer to infantry than is possible with any organic artillery weapons.
By November, the 106th settled into positions surrounding the city of Strasbourg, continuing its support of the 45th Infantry Division. The Allied push continued in the coming weeks, and once again, Hayden Allen's Battery C was in the forwardmost position, being the first unit of the 106th to cross the German frontier near Bobenthal on December 20th, 1944. Confronted with the imposing Black Forest and the onset of winter, the front stabilized, and in February, the 106th were removed from the line along with the 45th Infantry Division for rest and recuperation. By mid-March, both units returned to the line, crossed the Rhine River, and drove toward Frankfurt. German air attacks remained infrequent, although they now included the Me-262, the world's first jet-powered fighter aircraft. Anti-aircraft crews complained that the jet was too fast, and their guns were practically useless against this new air weapon. Nonetheless, their primary role remained close artillery support for infantry units. During April, the 106th traveled over 12 miles per day, ending the month in Munich. Just over a week later, on May 8, 1945, the German army surrendered, and the 106th mission shifted to patrolling the streets of Munich and the surrounding towns and villages. Within a few weeks, the 106th was transferred to the rear and began limited guard duties near Frankfurt. With the European theater of the war now closed, there was little need for anti-aircraft units. All men of the 106th who stormed ashore nearly 3 years prior in North Africa had accumulated enough points to return home. Hayden Allen, promoted to corporal during the war, was one of those men, formally being discharged from the Army on September 15, 1945, at Camp Atterbury, Indiana. For the replacements who joined the 106th later in the war, they returned home to New York on December 2, 1945. The 106th was formally deactivated the following day, with their mission accomplished. Hayden Allen settled in Kindleville, Indiana, married a woman named Minnie Krager, and they raised 3 sons together. Sadly, he passed at the untimely age of 50. His tombstone proudly proclaims his service in the war and that he was a member of Battery C of the 106th Coastal Artillery Battalion. The 106th largely faded into obscurity after the war. Many of the American histories of the European theater focused on the events after D-Day, when Allied air superiority resulted in ground-based anti-aircraft units being an afterthought. Still, the 106th was an exemplary unit and was credited with shooting down 146 enemy aircraft. The memory of the 106th was revived in the early 1990s as communities across the country sought to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the war. In 1992, Washington County, Kentucky organized a program to remember Battery C, which contained several local men, and many of the unit's surviving veterans showed up for a reunion. In 2021, the Air Defense Artillery Training Support Facility at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which is tasked with teaching air defense techniques to current American soldiers, featured the 106th as its example of outstanding air defense efforts during World War II, and made the battalion's artifacts a permanent feature of its museum collections. Through these efforts and others, the story of the 106th will live on, and future generations will learn of the heroic and skilled actions of the men from Kentucky that contributed in a profound way to Allied victory in Europe.